If there's one thing from the old T-Theory video I regret, it's that I went too hard assuming that Kris has some deep-seated distaste for Ralsei, which I gathered from Ralsei T having a strangely low healing value for Kris. I do think the T-Theory is meant to signify something real, some hidden negative feelings towards Ralsei, but it was a mistake to assume this meant anything approaching outright hatred. The new chapters abundantly disprove the notion that Kris's feelings for Ralsei are strongly negative. One thing I cited as additional proof that Kris might not have liked Ralsei was Kris apparently sounding confused if you choose Ralsei to go to the festival with when Susie asks who you'd take. I took this as a sign of some sort of disinterest in Ralsei specifically, but it could have been a simple preference for Susie. And besides, now that this very idea has been discussed by Susie herself, we have a much more obvious reason Kris would be confused as to this suggestion, simply because Ralsei is a Darkener and cannot go to the festival in the light world. It's a much more sensible and straightforward explanation for why Kris wouldn't understand giving such a response, and it's one that doesn't indicate any negative feelings at all, just an awareness of how the dark world works, which is probably well within Kris's character given who's opening these fountains after all. More substantial proof that Kris doesn't dislike Ralsei lies in certain reactions Kris has to specific dialogue choices. We've previously seen signs that Kris can emote independently of the intent behind player dialogue choices. For instance, when you pick Noelle for the festival when talking to Susie, she asks why you're saying it all confused, revealing Kris's true feelings regardless of player intentions. Another notable instance of this occurs after defeating Spamton, where regardless of whether you answer that you're okay, Ralsei and Susie clearly react in a way that shows Kris is having some sort of emotional breakdown after seeing what happened to Spamton and his inability to attain free will. And another final instance that a lot of people noticed was when talking to Monster Kid, Kris gets really annoyed at hearing Susie being bad-mouthed. All of these are indicated by other characters' reactions to Kris, and as can be seen from Ralsei's reactions, Kris actually acts against you if you choose options that are particularly cruel to Ralsei. Most obviously, when visiting Ralsei's room, you have an opportunity to say that Ralsei, as a Darkener, is wrong to have feelings, and Kris will completely sabotage an effort to choose this dialogue option, covering their mouth to get the exact opposite meaning across. There's also another case where, when saying you've seen Ralsei's face before, Kris apparently laughs it off. A statement of his inadequacy is passed off as a joke. At least that's how I read it. I could be wrong on this one. But it seems to me like another case of Kris looking out for Ralsei, regardless of what dialogue choices you choose. It's notable that Kris would act out to forbid you from picking on Ralsei because it's very rare for Kris to defy player choices like this, which would suggest that not only does Kris not dislike Ralsei, but Kris is actually pretty considerate of Ralsei in particular, in fact. Maybe Kris is just a good-natured person who doesn't mind a hug but does mind being a jerk, but it could be that I was totally wrong and Kris really does like Ralsei quite a bit, or at least enough to consider his feelings. There could still be some sort of apprehension, wariness, or uncertainty, but even that could have been a mistaken assumption on my part. Either way, we can absolutely rule out hatred at this point. Noelle was a prominent character in T-Theory speculations as well, and unlike Ralsei, we've gotten some definitive answers for the questions her reactions raised. The weird bit about Noelle was that her reaction to Kris T noted a mysterious aftertaste. We've gotten some pretty strong confirmation that this reaction to the T was indeed foreshadowing Noelle having some uncommon awareness of Kris being affected by the soul. In the holiday residence, you can learn that Noelle is the only one who recognizes Kris as being different ever since the soul entered the picture. This dialogue only occurs in a Snowgrave route, as it's in response to Kris apologizing for it off-screen. And while Kris's default independent persona is a mischievous person that most people seem to have some wariness towards, Noelle has an affinity for that person through the good and the bad, the person that we've replaced. Noelle and Kris have been estranged as of late, and at first I figured it was due to whatever happened to December and Azrael moving away, life going on, but it seems the main reason they're in this estranged state now is due to the soul making Kris a different person. Kris seems foreign to Noelle. not the friend she knew her whole life. This brings us back to Noelle's reaction to Kris T. This is why she sensed a peculiar aftertaste, one that isn't as pleasant and familiar as the cinnamony butterscotch memory of her good friend that she reminisces over. In these last 2 chapters, all indications seem to show that Kris and Noelle were very close in the past. Even if Kris was sort of a brat, it's easy to see why a big, inexplicable, sudden personality shift from the soul showing up would alienate a close friend like Noelle. In short, the T theory really did seem to be foreshadowing something that we now see substantiated. Noelle recognizes that Kris is not really Kris when under the player's influence, something that no one else really has that level of awareness of. So, T theory's most interesting points are one for one as far as what most people gleaned from them. The bit about Kris's reaction to Ralsei T was misjudged by a lot of us, and I don't think this means T theory should be thrown out wholesale, but perhaps a recalibration is in order. It should not be assumed that any particular value indicates hatred, especially given that Kris is healed decently by Ralsei T anyway, and a surprisingly low value might just mean some vague apprehension, if anything at all. In any case, I expect T-Theory only to become less relevant, as in Chapter 3, these items have all been supplanted by Rotten Tea, a worthless item that heals for 10 HP across the board and provides no interesting reactions. I figure this indicates a lack of further interest in this concept from the creator. There will probably not be much more to learn about any of the tea or any of the reactions we've seen in the future, but we did get some closure on a couple of the biggest questions.